I'm Carol Lucas. Today I'll critique a research report on the topic, Does exposure to media violence increase an individual's likelihood of engaging in violent behaviour? Let me start by disclosing my own personal bias on this topic. I hate violence in media and anywhere else. I physically struggle to watch it, and I may have a level of post-traumatic stress following an accident that injured my older brother. On the other hand, I have 3 primary school aged children who play video games and watch YouTube clips involving varying levels of animated violence. And you know what? I believe they're pretty normal kids who engage in average levels of sibling aggression and have sweet and helpful natures. So I would say I'm repulsed by violence personally, but I allow my children to view violence in moderation, and I don't think that it impacts them all that much. Today I'll be discussing a research paper by Boxer, Bushman, Huseman, Masseri and O'Brien titled The Role of Violent Media Preference in Cumulative Developmental Risk for Violence and General Aggression, which was published in the journal Youth and Adolescence in 2009. The authors point out that despite large numbers of studies linking violent video games with violent behaviour, current practice and literature does not include violent video gameplay as a risk factor for violent, delinquent or antisocial behaviour. They point out the limitation of previous studies which excluded violent offenders or included them only at a low population-based inclusion level. As you would imagine, studies carried out on college or student populations naturally exclude violent offenders who have been sent to correctional facilities. The authors also point out that the impact of violent media is one risk factor among many, and they seek to uncover the impact of violent media alongside some of these other risk factors. The researchers expected that exposure to media violence would increase the incidence of violent behaviour when other risk factors were taken into account. The study participants were 820 youth from different environments. 430 high school students and 390 incarcerated youth took part in the study. Youth in juvenile detention centres were sampled from both state and county facilities, and students were sampled from both urban and rural schools. A mix of boys and girls were sampled. 51% of the student population were girls and 26% of the juvenile detention group were female. Measures were taken by survey and included surveys of the youth, their parents and teachers, or in the case of detained youth, the staff at the facility who knew the students well. Multiple surveys were completed and results from each contributor were reviewed to provide a measure for each participant on each of the scored criteria. Surveys were completed once per participant and were completed over a period of 2 years. Answers to questions regarding past viewing habits were based on individuals' memory of that time. Measures included past preference for violent media, current preference for violent media, exposure to real-world violence at home or in the community, psychological measures, and measures of violent and antisocial behaviour. The measures of exposure to real-world violence include viewing and being the victim of real-world violence were included as important known risk factors for violence. Personality traits, which are risk factors for violence, were included. They were callousness, academic skills, which are inversely correlated, depression and psychotism. Many more risk factors for violence exist, but were not measured due to the need to limit the time for interviews and questionnaire completion. Questionnaires were taken from previously published and well-regarded sources. The limitations of self-report on media viewing habits are common in this type of study. Longitudinal analysis with more regular self-report might have resulted in better accuracy of this measure. The research results, as predicted, show a correlation between the preference for media violence and violent behaviour, but also showed a correlation between all other risk factors and media violence. The researchers performed an analysis whereby they created a composite of other risks, which excluded the media violence results, and a total risk composite, which included media violence results. They found that media violence contributed significantly to the total risk of violent behaviour. That is, in the presence of other risk factors, all things being equal, preference for and exposure to violent media does increase the risk of violent behaviour. I believe the findings of this research are important for two reasons. First, they provide evidence for future inclusion of exposure to media violence in the assessment of risk for violent behaviour, which should result in better clinical and therapeutic outcomes. Assessment of risk is the first step in interventions to modify future behaviour. Considering that treatment and interventions tends to be limited by financial resources, the correct identification of risk upfront is crucial. And including this measure will increase the accuracy of future risk assessments. Secondly, it lays to rest the issue of alternative hypotheses used to rule out media violence as a risk factor for violent behaviour. The correlation with multiple risk factors can result in assumptions, for example, the preference for media violence being considered just a symptom of a mind already predisposed to violent behaviour. This study clearly indicates that the preference for violent media and exposure to violent media is a risk factor independent of other personality factors. Further research, including longitudinal studies and the addition of further known risk criteria, could provide additional insights for the use of assessment of risk in the future. But I believe this paper is a major contribution and the first step in a new direction for investigation of the impact of media violence on us all.